Прошу рассаживаться. У нас последний доклад на сегодня. Майк Burrows поделится с нами идеями о том, как повысить свою собственную продуктивность. Майк.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for having me in Moscow. It's my first time in Moscow, first time in Russia at all. I've really enjoyed my stay, so thank you. Some of you know me as the author of Kanban from the Inside. That was a Kanban book that came out just over a year ago, September last year. It's now been translated into German, if you prefer German to English. It looks wonderful, I can't understand it myself. My background is in development. I was a developer for a long time, and then I became a development manager. I had a 12-year career at UBS in the investment bank. In fact, at one point I was running global development for their bond platform. So that's my kind of background. That's the kind of background that I know I share with a lot of you at this conference. More recently, training, consultancy, interim management, those kinds of things. And most recently, is this clicker working? I launched it in June. I launched in June a thing called Agenda Shift. And this is really a follow-on from my book. The first 9 chapters of my book are about the 9 values that I took from the Kanban method. Things like transparency, balance, collaboration, those kind of things. And I finished with a checklist of, as many books do, finished with a checklist of things you should be looking for if you're successfully implementing Kanban. That checklist became the assessment tool, part of the value-based delivery part of Agenda Shift. I'm now building out a hypothesis-based change management tool, and there's also leadership training and things like that associated with it as well. So that's my new thing. So are we there yet? Quite actually, if we're going somewhere, it's quite a good idea to have some understanding of where we are. And I have a scale for measuring where we are, and it goes like this. It's very easy to remember, 4-point scale. Barely started, if at all. Early gains, so we're beginning to make some progress. Getting there, we can actually begin to see our destination, perhaps. And then nailing it consistently. We're not just learning how to do something, it's now become a habit. We do it all the time, we do it consistently well, and so on. So we're going to apply that scale to some questions. Give you a few moments to digest the questions. I'll read some of them out for the benefit of those at the back. Our delivery process is visible. We can see where each work item sits in that delivery process. We can see who is working on what. We can see which work items are blocked and for what reason. We review our progress frequently. A slightly more long one. Policies that govern our progress are made explicit and are regularly reviewed. Now just look at those for a moment and think to yourself, are mainly ones and twos, twos and threes, threes and fours, maybe even mainly fours? So where do you think you are on that scale? Who thinks they're mainly ones? So a couple of hands up. Ones and twos? A few more. Twos and threes? Of those twos and threes, are you mainly twos or mainly threes? Twos, right. Threes and fours? Not so many. Any fours? I've asked this question quite a few times, and actually the number of people putting their hand up for mainly 4 is very, very low. One team from the BBC put their hand up at a conference I did in the north of England, and talking to them afterwards, I think they fully justified their 4. Another person who put their hand up with a 4 was the marketing director of Linkit, the Kanban tool, so he had to. So I've done a survey, global survey, using the Agenda Shift assessment tool to see how people around the world would assess themselves. Using some questions just slightly more elaborate than the ones I've asked there. And these are the kind of results that we can see. So if you were mainly ones and twos, you're actually in very good company. 58% of people overall, across all the questions, were in the ones and twos. So a very clear majority in the ones and twos. 42% were in the getting their category or nailing it, so threes and fours. That's across all the questions, that's across 44 questions. For the transparency questions, like the ones you answered, just slightly more of them, slightly more elaborate questions. 46% ones and twos, 54% threes and fours. Actually, for transparency, and only for transparency, this is the only category where the majority of the answers were threes and fours. So a lot of people really can do transparency, they appreciate transparency. But even within that category, there's some very interesting findings. Look at these two. We review our progress frequently, typically during daily stand-up meetings. That's beyond 2. So across everybody that we surveyed, the majority were at least a 3, maybe a 4. We review regularly the overall effectiveness of the end-to-end delivery process and the policies that govern it. That's down at the 2 end of the scale. So everybody's doing daily stand-ups. No one's doing service reviews. People aren't having effective retrospectives or whatever their particular way of reviewing how well their work is working. I don't know if you find that surprising. I was shocked initially that so few people are doing that, but then it is actually in keeping with so much that I've seen when I've gone out and training people, coaching people, and so on. At the other end of the scale, now this was genuinely a shock. Up until a week ago, the very worst category was balance. Balance is the category that I care probably the most about. It's the category that's about, are we overburdening people with too much work, for example? Are we paying attention to the mix of work in our system? Are we paying attention to the different kinds of stakeholders, our customers, the people in the system, around the system, and so on? It's a really powerful, really important category, and it comes out bottom. And that just speaks volumes about the state of our industry, I think. I won't show you any questions about balance just yet, but we will come to some. So what we're going to do, we're going to understand how transparency and balance work. Now, you've been here now to a Lean Kanban conference for a couple of days, so I think most of you will have a pretty good idea how transparency and balance work. But we'll go through those anyway. And then on the way, we'll see a little bit about collaboration and flow as well. We're not going to touch customer focus or leadership in this talk. Let's save that for another time. And then we're going to do it. How many this morning were in the Featureban session? So about, or not even a quarter of you, but a few hands have gone up. Featureban is a game I invented last year. It's a very simple and good fun way to experience how Kanban systems work. And what I've done, all the slides in yellow are covered by a Creative Commons license. I encourage you to take the slides and do whatever you want to do it. Adapt them to your own needs, translate them into Russian if that's what you want to do, all those kind of things. We already have multiple translations made of the game. But it's very easy to learn and it's good fun. And the way it works is that we start simply and then we add elements to teach new concepts, new ideas, new techniques. So here, this is 3 games of Featureban happening in parallel. This is in Derby, which is the county town of Derbyshire, which is where I live, right in the middle of England. We start with visual management. So we've seen lots of Kanban boards over the last couple of days. Here's a simple Kanban board with 4 columns. And what we're doing, we're making our work visible, our work items. Now our job here is to build a car or to design a car. So we've got work items like steering wheel, engine, carpets. Those are quite basic things. There's some luxury items as well, with an iPod dock, a flux capacitor, and an ejector seat. And we just choose a product that we can make. And cars are a very popular choice where we can very quickly, very easily generate lots and lots of features. I mean, this morning, I think most teams had to generate something like 30 or 40 features to build. Another bit of visualization is the process that we go through. Now here I've just called it state A and state B, and so those are two states that the work goes through between ready and complete. In the game, the teams themselves choose the names of those states. They choose what their process is. So it'll be something like design and build, or build and test, something like that. What happens next depends on the toss of a coin, like it does in a lot of games. If you have a coin, take one out of your pocket or your purse. Do this one-handed, it's very dangerous. Right. If you threw heads, who actually tossed a coin? I didn't see too much activity out there actually. You're all asleep, it's all the end of the day. If you had thrown heads, you'd have been with me. Now I have some choices. I can choose one action if I throw a head. I can take one of my items. Now, we know it's my item. Those are my initials there, MB. I own this one. I own the steering wheel. I'm the steering wheel expert. I advance my item. Or instead, I could choose to start a new one. I might decide, well, I may be the steering wheel expert, but I'd really like to give rear view mirrors a go. So start that one. Or, now suppose the steering wheel item got blocked, I had a dependency on something, my supplier let me down, for example, or I couldn't get approval for something. In the game, we show items as being blocked by writing B on them. That's not how we do it in real life, but it works well for the game. We use tiny little stickies, just put little B in the corner. If I throw a head, I can unblock my blocked item just by crossing that out. I have one last option. If I have no other options available to me, I can help somebody else. That's realistic, isn't it? If we've got more interesting things to do, we'll work on our own work rather than help somebody else. That's built into the game. Now, if you threw tails, this is bad news. You have to block one of your items. So Nick here, NT, has had to write a B on his item. But in compensation, if he can't work on his item, he's thrown a tails, he's not allowed to advance anything, he might as well take ownership of one of those tickets. I mean, again, that's what you do. You get stuck. What do? You work on something else. That's much more interesting than trying to resolve your issue, trying to unblock your blocker. So that's built into the game. We can compare those rules against 3 out of the 6 practices of the Kanban method. So we saw these in David's keynote presentation yesterday. So visualize, make policies explicit, implement feedback loops. So we're visualizing our work items. We saw those sticky notes up on the screen. We're visualizing our workflow, the different stages that our work items go through. We actually see those work items in those stages, and we can see when they're blocked. Pretty standard stuff in terms of visualization. Make policies explicit. We've actually done a good job of that. We've got very well defined rules of how the work is allowed to move through the system. What happens when you throw heads, what happens when you throw tails, when you're allowed to make one choice, when you're allowed to make multiple choices, those kind of things. And lastly, implement feedback loops, a very important practice. We have a feedback loop, a stand-up meeting, we all throw our coins, we tell each other in our teams what we threw, and we agree what moves we're going to make. That's our stand-up meeting. We also have a replenishment meeting. At the beginning of the game, and whenever we run out of tickets, we have a meeting to generate new features, to populate our ready column. So that's the analogue of the replenishment meeting in a real Kanban system. We can go back to our assessments and check. It looks like we've got a pretty mature system already here. We've got visibility, we can see where the work is, we can see who's working on what, we can see what's blocked. We've got our stand-up meeting to review our progress. I think I may have been a bit too generous on the last one. I'm not sure that's really a 3. But policies are made explicit, that is true. But we're not reviewing them regularly. There's no meeting to review our policies. possibly a 2 rather than a 3. But anyway, that looks pretty good. Why then is the performance of the system so appalling? It's terrible. Awful was the word used by one of the teams this morning. This here is Carl. He's one of my ex-colleagues. Now, he's always smiling. So that tells you nothing about the performance of the system. He always smiles. He really does. Started with 12, 15 items. Only 2 delivered. Everything in that second column. Couple of items over here. So it's all starting and no finishing. Lots of activity, no delivery. Is that familiar to any of you? Is that how it feels at work? For some of you, it may do. So what went wrong? Now we've got another set of questions, the balance questions. And here it's all 1s and 2s, so this is telling us something quite important. Does our delivery process balance demand with capacity? We end up with unlimited amounts of work in the system. Does our delivery process have a clear commitment point that separates potential work from work in progress? Well, it does, but it's kind of meaningless. I mean, you can start any item at any time, and it has, no consequences. We pull work into and across the delivery process only as capacity allows. That's probably the key question, along with the first one. We prefer to finish work items already in progress than to start new work items. One of the teams this morning reported that a pattern they see all the time, and I'm sure you recognise this one, is that they're working on something, and then the same customer that gave that piece of work to do gives them another piece of work, and another piece of work, and another piece of work, and then they never actually get to finishing anything because they're always given new things to start. We keep our work in progress in healthy balance based on type, source and customer expectations. This is quite a sophisticated one, but if you've managed a team of any size, you'll know that this is true. You don't want to have everybody working on only one thing. Actually, hedging your bets a bit is healthy. Serving different customers can be healthy. Having fixed date work and non-fixed date work and background work, all these other different kinds of work happening all at the same time is a healthy system. It's one where you can easily borrow people or borrow work to make the system more predictable, and it's one that feels comfortable for the people working in the system. We are nowhere near that level of sophistication in the Featureban game. In scheduling releases, we balance economic value with delivery cost. Slightly generously, I gave this a 2. In Featureban, there's actually no cost of delivery. If you throw ahead, then you deliver. There's no extra cost to moving it to that last column. There's no deployment cost. And we pay no thought whatsoever to economic value. It's just not a consideration. Anyone can choose a ticket for whatever reason they like. It just looks interesting. They like the colour of the ticket even. So how do we fix that? I think you all know the answer now. You've been at this conference for 2 days. I'm sure you've heard about limiting work in progress. And the specific technique we're going to use is the very popular one of the column limits, the limits on the columns of our board. So these number 3s, and we are committing to having no more than 3 items in each of those columns. Now we actually started with more work than 3 in those columns when we played the game. You remember how Carl was with all that work in that second column? We don't ask him to move his work back, but we do ask him not to move any more work into a column that's over capacity. That's the only change we make. Sometimes I like to labour this point. I get teams to look at the old rules and the new rules side by side and get them to agree that that is the only thing that I've changed, the column limits. So what happens? What effect does that have on the moves I can make? Can I move this steering wheel ticket to the right if I throw ahead? Well, of course I can. It's my item and there's capacity in the next column. Can I move the rear view mirror ticket? Well, no, I can't because this column is full to capacity. And this one's more subtle. Can I move the engine ticket? answer is I can't. Because remember the rule, I can only help somebody else, I can only help Sam if I have no other options, and I have the option of moving the steering wheel ticket. Could you move that ticket? Anybody? Anyone other than... If you're not me and you're not Nick, can you move that ticket?
No, because I have options for me.
Yes. Oh, no, if you're not me, and you're not Nick, can you move that ticket? At least you can. You have no other options. So yes, you can. Very subtle change. The rules stay exactly the same, but the work in progress limits and that rule about not helping people unless you have no other option, they interact in an interesting way. And look at the result. Carl's smiling again. But look at the output. We've got the work in progress nicely under control, and everything's over here. And it all happened so quickly, Lynn's needed a drink of water. I mean, she's hardly getting over it. And we do our assessment again. Big change in the first one. Our delivery process balances demand with capacity. We are specifically avoiding overburdening our system. Now, the only reason this is a 3 and not a 4 is that we haven't actually, in any systematic way, tried to work out what the capacity of our system actually is. I've just said 3. 3 for each column. Our delivery process has a clear commitment point that separates potential work from work in progress. We didn't actually change the rules around commitment, but it's much more meaningful now that we're only allowed a certain amount of work in the system. We pull work into and across the delivery process only as capacity allows. That's gone from a 1 to a 4. It's a massive change. We prefer to finish work items already in progress than to start new work items. That's not built into the rules, but that very quickly becomes your behaviour. You realise that when you move a ticket to the completed column, that creates room for someone else to move one of their tickets. The one about healthy balance, healthy mix of work, different types of work, we've made no change there at all, nor in the last one, the one about the economics. And going back to this one, we prefer to finish work items already in progress than to start new work items. As I said, the team realises that when they move a ticket from column 3 to column 4, they're creating an opportunity for someone else to move something from 2 to 3. That in turn creates an opportunity for someone to move something from column 1 to column 2. This is how Kanban systems work. When the work moves forwards, signals move backwards very, very quickly. And the team realises this, and they start to discuss it, and they start to think, oh, if you move that, I can move that. And if we do this in that order, we're going to get far more work out of the system than if we just went round the desk in our obvious order. That has an effect on flow. We complete tickets much more quickly, with much shorter lead times, more predictable lead times. This has gone from 1 to a 3 and not a 4 because although it feels a lot faster, it feels that we're delivering things sooner. We haven't actually measured it yet. We're going to do that in another iteration. Made no change to prioritisation. We're not measuring lead times and predictability, but we can certainly feel that it's very, very significantly better. We proactively identify and manage dependencies and other impediments. Like I said, the team realises that they can sequence their work in a way that gives better outcomes. That leads to collaboration. So by adding Whipland, we actually get people talking to each other. It's extraordinary. The volume of noise in the room goes up in the second iteration relative to the first iteration. I make a point when I debrief the game of not mentioning the word collaboration until the people who played the game observed the effect. It's so much better when people discover it for themselves rather than me telling them. We meet frequently to synchronise what we're doing and what we know. That's happening in the stand-up meeting, and it's much more meaningful than it was. We meet regularly to review performance and identify opportunities for improvements. We're beginning to do that in our debriefs. After each iteration, we're starting to think of how things could be better. And we frame improvements as safe to fail experiments. I've given this a 2. We have made an improvement I've not framed it as a safe to fail experiment. Me as the boss has said 3. Yeah. 3 more core practices for you. Limit work in progress. So we've done that with the column limits. And we now have a Kanban system, a proper Kanban system, not just a Kanban board, but a system where the board tells us where there's capacity in the system. We're managing flow. We're certainly seeing better flow. We're seeing more smoothness. We're seeing work delivered faster. You could say it's more timely, although we actually don't have a concept of when something should be delivered. We pay no attention, unfortunately, to economic outcomes. That's something the teams do notice and do complain about. There's no customer focus whatsoever in this game. Improve collaboratively, evolve experimentally using models and the scientific method. That wins the award for the longest core practice, I think. We did improve collaboration, that's one of the values, but we're not really improving scientifically. As I said already, it was a change that I imposed, and no one else understands or needs to understand why I decided to do that. They're just asked or told to do it. Iteration 3 is about metrics. We find we're getting good at the game now. We can play it really, really quickly. And the burden of collecting a little bit of extra data so that we can generate some nice looking charts, it's actually not a big deal at all. Just a few minutes of playing the game again, writing a few numbers down as we play it. This is a cumulative flow diagram. It's not a very interesting one. Can I ask for a show of hands? Who knows what a cumulative flow diagram is? That's about half of you. Who knows what a burn-up chart is? Or a burn-down chart? That's more of you. So if you think about it, think of the bottom layer here as the burn-up chart for the whole process. And these other lines as the burn-ups for the stages in the process. Here's a more realistic one. So this is from a real project. This is actually from the project in my book. You see the work expand dramatically at the beginning of the project. You see this rather embarrassing, massive load of work in progress here. I'm testing. So actually we haven't worked out how to test it yet. So we move our work from development to testing and it just sits there for a long time. For, I don't know how many months. Oh, the dates have come out in Russian, I didn't expect that. I can't read the dates. From October to, what's this month? December. So 2 months. We had this work sitting in test without us really knowing what we're going to do with it. For several more months, work sitting ready to release, but we weren't able to release it. That's for organisational reasons, not for technical reasons. And then suddenly, these big staircases are releases. When you see a staircase in a CFD, that's a batch transfer. That's when a lot of work, all at the same time, moves from one state to another. So from tested to ready to deploy, from ready to deploy to deployed, and so on. Something else happens here is the staircases start to get smaller, and we start to get it so it's just lines going up the page. Now, lines going up the page from bottom left to top right are usually good, and that's definitely true of a CFD. Lines doing that means we're getting smooth flow. You know, we're not getting those big staircases anymore. We're not seeing work ballooning. We're getting each of the stages of the work moving nicely in harmony with each other. So we're starting to see that emerge at the end of this picture. Later on, I don't have the data for it unfortunately, but later on we had better performance even though we were supporting a live system and starting a new project. So we were a much more mature team over here than we were over here. It wasn't just that we understood our system better. Another very easy chart to understand is the run chart. We make a note when a piece of work goes into the system as to what day it is, and then another note when it leaves the system as to what day it is then, and the difference between the 2 dates is how long it took. So the first item here took 3 days to deliver, this one took 3 days to deliver, this one took 5 days to deliver, and so on. Who can tell me how many items took 3 days? How many items took 3 days?
Exactly 3 days.
Exactly 3 days. Yeah, 3. Yeah. So we can do that for any lead time. So So 2 items took 5 days. And we can build a histogram of that. Very typically shaped histogram, a bulge near the beginning, and then it tails off. So our most popular one is 3. And if we take the cumulative lines, this is the cumulative distribution of our lead times, and read back from 50%, our median is 3 as well. So we can say our typical item takes 3 days to deliver. We might go for, say, our 85th percentile, a percentile that indicates that we can deliver with confidence. So we can deliver 85% of our work in around 6 days. So we can go to our customer and say, we can deliver our typical item in 3 days, but we're pretty confident we deliver most items within 6 days. Very easy statistics to calculate. There are some others. The mean. The mean is a difficult one because it tends to get skewed by your outliers, the ones that got blocked for months and months at a time. So tend not to use mean. The median is much more robust. Doesn't get influenced by outliers. The 85th percentile I've already explained. There's another one that I haven't explained yet. It's called flow efficiency. Now, you need to understand that this number is very suspiciously high. David did mention flow efficiency in his talk yesterday. It's not the easiest thing to calculate. It's easy to visualise when you're talking about one item. Where you have a whole portfolio of work, it can be a little harder. But here's how it looked for one item. We threw heads, and we did some useful work that moved our ticket on. So it went from the ready column into the first column, into the second column, into the build column, for example. The next day we threw tails. We had to block the item. On day 3, we threw heads again, fortunately, and unblocked the item. But that's all we achieved. We only achieved unblocking the item. We didn't achieve moving it forwards. That didn't happen until day 4, when we, again, very fortunately, threw heads again. On day 5, it didn't actually matter whether we threw heads or tails, but we were quite lucky here. We threw 4 or 5 heads out of 6. It didn't matter what we threw on day 5, because we chose to work on something else instead. So this is the key thing with flow efficiency. It's influenced not just by how long you're going to spend actually doing useful work, so that's this, and this, or by the amount of time work items spent blocked, that's this and this. But it's influenced mainly, in fact, or in most cases, by the amount of time work spends just not being attended to because we've got more interesting things to do. We bring work into the system, then it turns out we don't have the capacity to work on it, and it just sits there. Or work sits between stages in the process. We do some development work, and then it takes a week before we start test. Or we test a piece of work, and it takes another month before we can deploy it, because we only release monthly or quarterly or whatever. You add up those delays, and it's not unusual to have flow efficiencies that are in single digits. I mean, you now know how flow efficiency works, but if you show a number called flow efficiency to a manager, and it's 5%, your manager is going to say the word efficiency and 5% don't sit together very comfortably. You can then explain to him what it actually means and how you deal with it, and what you're dealing with. How can we make it more predictable in terms of things like blockers, but especially, how can we control the amount of work in progress in our system? How do we control the handoffs between stages in our process, and so on, to deliver us much faster flow through the system? It's a very interesting, very powerful metric. This morning, we played an interesting round. I don't do this every time I do Featureban. We did it this morning. This is a paper exercise. We're not moving stickers around anymore. We're thinking about how might we redesign the game in order to do better in some of these areas. So in terms of sequencing and prioritising our work, for example, improving the performance of the system. I I think 2 or even 3 of our teams this morning looked at prioritising. One team looked at improving performance and various ideas of how they might improve performance. These 2 are a bit too similar in terms of how I've worded them, but one of the teams chose this one, and they were very interested in the problem that whether it's because of different customers or even the same customer, you get different types of work in terms of the urgency from the customer. And it's not just that one is more urgent than the other, it's that there are different types of urgency. There's fixed date work, there's standard work, there's intangible work, the things you do in the background. There's the expedite work where you drop everything in order to get something done, and so on. The example I gave this morning was from my days at UBS. If the trading system was down and you are capable of fixing it, you dropped everything to fix it. And it could be costing $1 million an hour if that system is down. It makes no sense even to have a conversation about whether you should drop a piece of work, you just do it. We did a certain amount of fixed date work, but actually only a proportion, about 20% of our work was fixed date work. And that was mostly around external dependencies, external interfaces. We're connected to several exchanges around the world, and from time to time those exchanges would upgrade their APIs, and we'd have to upgrade our systems on exactly that same day to make sure that it retained compatibility with that external system. So that's work that was very, very much date bound, and again, it would be very expensive if we delivered late. You know, a day late meant a day out of that market. But even delivering early could actually have impact as well. You know, we might break something or it might fix itself again the next day. That was genuinely fixed date work. I say genuinely, there's a lot of fixed work that I see elsewhere isn't really fixed date work at all. It's just work where someone has arbitrarily given it a date. That in turn forces us to make bad decisions about priority. We finish something just because it needs to hit the date, not because it's the most important piece of work or the most valuable piece of work to the customer. Fortunately, my customers understood that, and we didn't do most of our work in a fixed date fashion. You know, we just worked on something until it was ready, and then we gave it to the customer as soon as we could. So that's in Kanban terms, we just call that standard work. We don't think most work should be fixed date. You know, the standard should be this sort of urgency-driven, value-driven type of work. There is another kind of intangible work, as I said, that's the maintenance work, that's the stuff you do in the background, that's tech refreshes, for example, it might be training your staff. The kind of things where if you stop doing them for too long, things get bad, but it's very hard to say if we don't do it tomorrow that you know, everything's going to suddenly fall apart. This is stuff that we keep ticking over in the background. The customer doesn't care about it, but a sensible customer will realise that it has to be done. So that was accommodating different kinds of customer expectations. Patrick's favourite is upstream and downstream teams. So you've got a team upstream, for example, it might be a design team, a UX team, for example. Downstream of them, you might have a development team. Downstream of them, you might have a test team. So this is a very functionally organised process. You don't have cross-functional people. You don't have these T-shaped people. You have handoffs between different functions. Some of these functions might be in other countries. You might have outsourced your testing to India, for example. Something I know quite well. It's not hard to imagine a version of the game with 2 boards and work passing between the boards, and you as a team coming up with some rules as to how that is going to work. So that's what we're doing here. So that's Featureban. We've done it in 4 iterations. We started simple. We added on a layer each time with a different concept, and we had fun and learned a lot on the way. What's really happening? Well, the most obvious bit of learning is this. It's the correspondence between the Kanban system and the actual work, the operational system. We move pieces of work across our Kanban board to reflect the fact that actual work is happening. That's at one level. At another level, we realise that we need to change the design of our Kanban system if the design of our operational system changes. Even more powerfully than that, if we change the design of our Kanban system, change the policies around the Kanban system, change the rules, in other words, like we did in the game, it can have a profound effect on how this operational system works. So that's one level of learning from using Featureban. Probably more important learning is the idea that you can actually step back from your system, think about how well it's working, and thinking about some intervention you might make in the design of your system, the design of your Kanban system, and or the design of your operational system. And it's actually that stepping back and reflecting and thinking not just about the game, not just about Featureban and stickies moving across the board in the game, but thinking about how that reflects how your work actually works when you're back at the office, thinking about the assumptions built into your process, and you begin to challenge those assumptions as well. I've drawn this diagram in this way for a reason. That idea of challenging your assumptions, challenging your values, beliefs, assumptions, frameworks, comes from a model called double loop learning. It's from an organisational psychologist called Chris Argyris. And the idea is this: from day to day, most of the time, we do stuff. And we know how to do stuff. We follow predictable patterns for doing that stuff. He calls these action strategies. It's just what we do. And there are results from doing what we do. Results and consequences, that's what we get from what we do. So that's the work getting done. But underpinning all that is the design of our system and the values, beliefs, assumptions, frameworks that support that design. From time to time, we need to challenge them. And playing a game like Featureban can actually challenge some of our own assumptions about how our work works. If we've never come across the concept of limiting our work in progress before, for example, that can be quite a challenging idea. Going back to David's presentation yesterday, he talked a lot about feedback loops, and what feedback loops are, they're opportunities for double loop learning. So we created an opportunity with Featureban. If you were in Sergey's workshop this afternoon, you'd be looking at static, which is the sort of standard approach we have for introducing Kanban. And it actually forces you to step back and not just design your Kanban board, but to think fundamentally about what's the kind of work that you do, the kind of customer relationships that you have, the kind of workflow that you have, fairly obviously, and so on. But look at that really hard. It's a thing called reverse static, where we backtrack through that analysis to refine it and use that as a trigger for improving our process. Then we can do the depth assessments, like the checklist we did earlier on in the talk. And we can do those repeatedly. We could do those, monthly or quarterly or something, and those might trigger some thoughts about how our process works, might generate some ideas of how we might want to improve it. And then there's the actual feedback loops, the ones that David showed yesterday, the things that we do very, very regularly, very predictably. Here's his picture again. So in the game, we had just the stand-up meeting and the replenishment meeting. Now just think of how much better it might have been if we'd actually planned our deliveries ahead of time. So not necessarily for date, but in terms of content. What we found as a team, that we could deliver the steering wheel and the rear view mirror, and those are the first two items that we delivered. They don't connect to each other, we can't test them together. It would be embarrassing to show them to a customer. We're so far away from the concept of an MVP, for example. So maybe if before we started replenishing our queues, we started to plan the kind of deliveries that we wanted to make, that would be good. Or conversely, when we have a lot of work in our third column, in the nearly done column, perhaps then we could take the opportunity to think, this is beginning to look interesting. If we delivered that and that, that's something we could show to the customer. So that's an example where we've decoupled the planning of our releases from the inputs of work into the system, and that's why actually they're on different sides of the page here. possibly the most important one of all. I might argue with David as to which the most important is, but for me, the service delivery review meeting has been a really powerful way of getting improvement into the minds of the teams that I've worked with. So we bring together production data, customer insight, plans for marketing, performance of the system, delivery performance, all these inputs from our customer support people, all these different kinds of data, and we bring them together into one meeting, and we just ask, does this all add up? Are we working on the right things that are going to make for happier customers, for less support, for a system that performs as well as we need it to perform, and so on? Really powerful thing, and that then generates ideas for either new features or potentially to changes to our system, to the design of our delivery process. That's the service delivery review meeting. You can do that at a bigger scale, and you can do it for multiple products or for multiple teams in the operations review. And that's a really good way of getting one team to encourage another team to improve, to encourage them by example, to sharing their successes and so on. On the side we have the strategy review and the risk review. So this is how we make sure that the work we're prioritising does align with our strategy. Over here we're thinking about the risks of our delivery and the risks that we're uncovering as we review our work, and that may in turn cause us to make different choices as to what we prioritise. So those are the standard ones. When I go into an organisation, I like to ask them, well, what actual feedback loops do you do? What meetings do you have? What reports do you send around? This kind of thing. I often ask them to send me their artefacts for their meetings to me before I even visit them. It tells me an awful lot about how they work and how they think. And very often I see nothing about vision. I see very little about where they're trying to get to. I see lots of issues. Even at the fortnightly and monthly meetings, they're stuck at the level of the day-to-day issues, and they use their reporting as a way of escalating their issues to managers. They never take time to step back and look at how well things are actually working. They're not stepping back to actually ask, is what we're building even making sense anymore based on what we know about the customer? So lots of opportunities there for learning. If your process now, your organisation now doesn't give time periodically, whether it's monthly or quarterly, from stepping back from your work and asking yourself, how well is it working? Do we need to challenge some of our assumptions? I'd encourage you to think about how you would actually introduce something like this into your organisation. So, agenda shift. You can think of agenda shift as a process, and it's a process I described in the last chapter of my book. So I started with identifying some values. I identified 9 values in the Kanban method. You can also, for your organisation, it may already have values that usefully guide our decision making, and I've been quite encouraged to work with organisations that do have these. And then you can ask, given a particular value, let's say transparency, how do we expect that to play out day to day? What would we expect to see around the organisation if we're committed to transparency? And we can do that for each of the values. We can then ask, how are we doing against each of those prompts? The prompts are based on the things we expect to see. We can analyse them, look for strong areas, for weak areas, for areas where there might be some encouraging signs and green shoots of growth, or there might be some worrying areas where we're actually worried that we're going to regress because we have a key weakness somewhere that needs to be addressed. And from that we agree an agenda for change. In the workshop this morning we prioritised 3 particular areas. We could go further than that. We could try and produce some kind of narrative, some kind of story about what we're trying to achieve by making improvements in these particular areas. And finally there's action, and we spent a long time, 2 hours this morning, on how to frame our actions in a good way. We did hypothesis-driven change. So the hypothesis, rather than saying we know that this change is going to have this effect, instead we hypothesize it's going to have this effect. We believe that making this change will have that effect, and we'll know if we're being successful in our change because we're seeing these pieces of evidence come out of our system. Makes us think a lot more deeply about what we're doing, what we expect to see, helps us think about risks, uncovering risks, helps us uncover possible side benefits, ones that benefits we can't necessarily plan for, but we might wish for and can help to encourage. We also talked about who are the different people that we're going to need to engage in order to implement this change successfully. So that's the action part. And we can think about this in terms of feedback loops as well. So we're tracking our actions. If you're tracking anything, that's pretty much implies a feedback loop. But when we run out of good actions, valuable actions, we can go and do another assessment. And when we're finding that even doing that isn't actually helping us as much as it used to, we're just coming up with the same answers all the time, it's not generating anything fresh, we can step back from that and ask, do we actually have the right set of values? Have we uncovered all the ways that those values should be exemplified? Are our values well aligned with the company's values? Perhaps there's some kind of clash there that we need to resolve. Some organisations, for example, have a real problem with transparency. Or some managers like to hide information because it gives them power. So that's just one example. So if that is the case, then implementing Kanban is actually going to be difficult. You might work in an organisation where the facilities people, the people who run the building, don't like to see stuff on the walls. I had one place I was working at this year where we were told that our Kanban boards were a fire hazard. All those post-it notes, so they're about to catch fire and we had to take it down. Stupid things like that. That's just about me done. Just to mention that the assessment you can try for free. Like the book, it's just been translated into German. There's a French version of it as well, if you're interested. The main version is still obviously in English. And I think it just remains for me to say thank you, and I don't know how much time we have for questions. Okay, we have time for questions, 10 minutes or so.
Thank you, Mike. Any questions?
Thirsty, that's what it is.
Nobody wants to practice English.
Well, thank you very much.